Amazing. Thank you everyone for your immense patience. I'm really excited about this panel and I've been thinking about a lot of the issues that we're going to unpack today. Obviously, we only have about 50 minutes, so if I start motor mouthing through it and I'm talking too quickly for you, please do put it in the chat and ask me to slow down. So today's webinar and discussion is around circularity in fashion systems. I mean, according to the Research and Technology Group Common Objective, over 90 global brands have actually signed on to Global Fashion Agenda's 2020 Circular Fashion System commitment. But of course, there's a lot of words in there. There's a lot of these terms that we use to kind of set targets for where our industry should be going. But often we don't stop to think about what those words really mean, what those concepts are, and particularly when we're talking about this industry, what the application is for Global South and particularly Southern African communities. So to join me today, I have three really amazing guests who I'm excited to speak to. The first is Dr. Nadine Sonnenberg, who recently actually attended a conference on this exact issue. So we're going to be getting some really fresh insights from her. Christina Wong, who joins us from Mauritius, and Federico Busio, who also joins us from Mauritius. My name is Binwe Adebayo, and I'm a senior writer at Twig, and also somebody who's just an enthusiast. So I'm here to talk, but I'm also here to learn. Just to give you a little bit more information about our panelists, Dr. Nadine Sonnenberg is a senior lecturer in the Department of Consumer and Food Science at the University of Pretoria. She holds both a master's and a PhD in consumer science, and she's really interested in the complexities of environmental and socially responsible consumer behavior in the clothing and textile domain. So I think that's going to be really interesting because we're talking about local insights. Christina, who joins us, as I said, from Mauritius, is the Sourcing and Sustainability Executive of ABANA Mauritius. She holds an honors degree in textile design from the Glasgow School of Art, where she specialized in weaving. So I'm really interested to talk to Christina around textiles, responsible sourcing, and the like. And then our last panelist, who I don't know if has joined us, Federico Busio, completed his studies in environmental science in Australia and gained a lot of work experience working with denim, working in project management, and has a really keen interest in sort of macro politics and macroeconomics even around this issue. So how do we scale the kinds of things that we're talking about? So we welcome our panelists. We're so thankful to have you there. And of course, our audience as well. We really welcome you, and we hope that this becomes a home for you to really learn. As I say, we don't have a lot of time today, so the structure of this discussion is going to be open and conversational. We're going to talk to our panelists, get to know what their perspectives are on these matters. And then, of course, because you're our audience, we also want to open it up for you for questions at the end of our session. So we'll have a bit of a discussion between all of the panelists, but we also welcome you to add your comments in the chat, tell us what you're thinking. And if you take those comments outside of here, you're tweeting, you're snapping, you're Instagram storying, you YouTube shorting, whatever it is that you like to do to get your ideas out, then also just remember to tag TwigMag, and big thanks to PETCO who present this session. So, because I've now already given you a TED Talk, without further ado, let's get into our discussion. So Nadine, I'm going to start with you. So as I mentioned earlier, you recently attended the International Textile and Apparel Association Conference, and I'm sure there are experts and enthusiasts and all sorts of people who emerge out of that. And when I was doing the reading around circular fashion systems, I see that the term kind of originated around 2014. But I imagine that in its discussion and its application in different places, that it's evolved quite significantly, and that different people perceive it very differently. So to your mind, how do you understand, or how do you define circular fashion systems? And more importantly for us who kind of hear these words but want to know what their constituent elements are, what are the kind of key features or key elements of a circular textile system, of a circular fashion system rather?
Thank you, Binwe, for giving me the opportunity to answer that. I must say I've been in the sustainability domain already since 2008, and how the terminology and how it's evolved is quite extensive. But actually looking at circularity, if you just break it down from a more general point of view, it really stands for a model of production and consumption that is based on the R's. All the recycling, you know, reusing, repair. Recently also that's become very prominent is the secondhand, the collaborative consumption, and that, so that all fuses into it. But being, how can I say, fortunate enough to have attended the conference, the Sustainable Apparel and Textiles Conference at the beginning of the year, you know, what came through from that conference for me very prominently is that circularity in the fashion industry is based on two things, two very, very important things. And the one is designed to reuse, the other one would be to minimize waste. Those are the two very, very ultimate aspects to focus on. And so it's really, if you take another term that comes into play is the closed loop system. And closed loop recycling really per se is to look at recycling materials and products to the same or identical products. It's not like open loop where we perhaps downscale it. We can also upcycle, but it's more a really honestly system that is closed, where you've got textiles going into textiles, you've got fabrics going into fabrics. So just to highlight a few things, designers are massively important, because, you know, if we look at the world around us, everything is designed. It's made by a designer, and those designers have to choose materials. And designers these days have the option to choose sustainable materials, you know, and it's not like the thing years back, you know, when I just started off, there was always this thing, if I do have a recycled or sustainable material, that it's perhaps less quality. Now, through innovation, research, and so forth, we know that's not to be true anymore. You know, many of our recycled materials are equivalent to virgin materials. So we really don't have the excuses anymore not to go for the sustainable alternatives. But I think also from the conference, some very, very interesting stuff that came through there also is, you know, in that circular fashion system, how prominent secondhand and collaborative consumption has become. If you look at brands like Farfetched and so, you know, and one of the 10 innovations that really fascinated me is, you know, especially in the luxury segment, it's not just the, you know, the more middle class, you know, that type of segments. In the luxury segments, they, for example, now implementing QR codes in garments, you know, which you can scan and you can find out where was this garment designed, what materials, where was the material sourced, you know, was it repaired, up to the point where it's resold. So that whole history of that garment is starting to be given to the consumer to make decisions surrounding it. Another thing also, the last point that I would like to quickly make, you know, in this circular fashion system is, you know, we know that the fashion industry has always been plagued by this thing of excessive stocks, overproduction. We all know about fast fashion, which has also led to revenue losses and things like that. And so particularly with the COVID-19 over the past year, I think clothing retailers, manufacturers and so on, no, this is not anymore the answer. And so from the conference also, for me, that was quite prominent and interesting. And the next big thing coming through is the bench towards more custom made and made to order, and not that mass produced thing, you know. I think consumers are also very, very much changing in their perception as far as that is concerned, you know, not wanting all the mass produced, rather just focusing on what they need. So I think in a nutshell, that's some major points that came through from a conference in terms of circular economy. So, yeah.
It's so interesting that you point out that this kind of change is happening both from your kind of everyday retail market, but also your luxury brands who are kind of cottoning on, no pun intended, cottoning on to what's happening and kind of emerging that, because I know like your Stella McCartneys, your Balmains, Lanvin are all kind of moving towards that. And the irony for me around that is always around fast fashion is that that's what the smaller brands or the bigger mass market retailers copy. So maybe it's not a bad thing that it's sort of starting at the luxury level, because maybe then the copycat effect also extends to the kinds of materials that we're using. I'm going to cross over to Christina because I saw her very enthusiastically nodding there. And of course, as Christina, you're our go-to person when it comes to weaving and textiles and all of that. And I think that what Nadine is rightly pointing to is the idea that textiles and responsible textiles and the sourcing of them are a really important element of a sustainable fashion future. So I think consumers know, obviously, if you go into a particular retailer and you look at the label and it says organic cotton, that intuitively you kind of know, okay, that must be good. But on a broader spectrum, if we're talking about consumers getting to know textiles and recyclable textiles and responsible textiles better, what kinds of materials are we really talking about here? What are the kinds of textiles, fabrics that we need to be focusing on when we're building this circular system?
I want to bring up the important point that Nadine mentioned about circularity, being textiles going back to textiles, and especially because one of the not most sustainable textiles, but what had a lot of significance now in sustainable fashion, there's a lot of conversation about recycled PET, for example, that is very common in denim. But I think consumers might think that, for example, recycled PET is polyester turned back into polyester. But most of the time it's actually plastic bottles turning into polyester, which I think is problematic in a way, because actually if plastic bottles were recycled into new bottles, it could remain in a closed loop, but it's still very difficult to recycle textiles into textiles because there's not enough research, especially on the scale of an industrial scale, for recycling materials and without downscaling them. Because a lot of times there's a lot of blends in clothing. So you'll often see maybe 95% cotton, 5% polyester in a pair of jeans or in t-shirts as well. And because of the limitations of recycling material, most of the times these blends would be used in mattresses and insulations. So there's a lot of downgrade in materials at the moment. For example, recycled cotton is actually from pre-consumer waste and not from post-consumer waste. So there's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding, lack of transparency as well about what we mean by circular textiles, especially at the sourcing of materials. But as well as a designer, Nadine pointed out that it's very important for designers to take responsibility of what they put in the world. So what materials you use. And this is an important matter for me. It has been an important issue when I was a student, still now in my work, although I'm not a designer. But with a lot of research while studying, I realized that monomaterial is, in a way, the most efficient method to make sure that the loop is closed without downscaling the material. So 100% cotton can be recycled into 100% cotton without being, downgraded to being used in mattresses. But also there's a lot of challenges around that because, for example, if you make a t-shirt out of 100% cotton, the sewing thread might be polyester. So it means that the process is still very labor intensive to separate the materials. There's a lot of research about chemical recycling, but still so much to be done. So I think the most sustainable material, I don't know if there's, the right answer for that. It really depends on the designer. What do you want your end product to be? Do you want it to biodegrade, or do you want it to be deconstructed, reconstructed into something new? So yeah, it really depends on the brands, on the designers, but I do think this should be a question from the beginning of the design process. It's not something you think of halfway through. It should be from the roots of design. And also, for example, Fashion Revolution has been doing an amazing job at asking what's in my clothes. So a lot of times we don't really know where the materials are coming from. So I don't know if I'm answering your question by saying there's no 100% sustainable material. So it's really depending on what you want to achieve and whether you want it to stay in the loop or not.
I mean, I think that in and of itself is interesting because I think that potentially even the way I've framed that question leans into the idea that if I do enough, if I put my plastic water bottle in the recycling, if I only buy organic cotton, if I only do this, then, that's kind of a zero sum. Whereas I think what you're saying is it's also like, it's a mentality, it's a consciousness. It has to be built in at every step of the way.
Absolutely.
Rather than just I'm better than you because my shoes are made out of plastic. from the sea, you know, because I think that, you know, the discussion can become a bit reductive. I'm going to move over to our third panelist, who's joined us, Federico, because I think that what I find really interesting about this discussion is that it has two components. On one level, what we're talking about here is, what is that system? What does it look like? What are its components? But I think that the other thing that we're talking about is, how do we get there? So Federico, I want to throw over to you. So from a macro perspective, when we're talking about now large scale production, we're not talking about a sort of cotton industry of me making my 5 t-shirts. You know, we're talking about corporate imperatives and all of these changes that need to be made, particularly in the African context. What actually needs to happen to affect the kinds of systems that both Nadine and Christina are talking about? And, you know, we have all of these targets around like net zero, but what do we really need to be considering as an industry on a macro scale to begin to make the possibility of circular systems possible, and possible at a kind of larger scale?
Good evening, everyone. Sorry that I was late, but I just finished work. Thank you for inviting me, first of all. Yes, just to reply to that question, the problem with sustainability at the fashion level actually lies in the fundamental concept of consumption. Fast fashion cannot recycle its way out. It's not possible to magically make an industry that is highly polluting into a sustainable one simply by swapping materials. The intrinsic concept of a fast fashion is about consuming, and consuming more the next day, always buying, and a short life cycle of the product. And this is the fundamental problem. Yes, I worked in the denim industry here in Mauritius. I can say that the company does a pretty good job in terms of circularity in material reuse, but nonetheless, the fact of mass producing, the fact of producing often in faraway places and shipping all over the world. So all of these, we are looking at the salt of grain without seeing literally the rock in front of us. The system that onto which the fashion industry is built is completely wrong. I mean, it can never be sustainable. Even if imagining, not to go back to the two panelists' points of discussion, even the concept of extended producer responsibility of a piece of a garment or a jeans. So somebody buys the jeans in England, in the US, it gets shipped to there, often from an online store, which is the way that the industry is moving. And then you use it, and after a bit, okay, you want to do your good action, you bring it back to the store, and that store sends it to a warehouse, and the warehouse sends it back to, let's say, Mauritius, from the US or from England. So just to recycle how much of that fabric will actually be recycled? I can tell you that the moment that you need to remove the zip, the buttons, the polyester thread that makes that joins the different components of a jeans, you really end up recycling best case scenario 50% of the fabric, considering that recycling is energy intensive, and that energy comes from coal. So talking about circularity is about having the systemic view, and not often, like in the case of the PET polyester, not often it actually, the solution addresses the problem. Effectively, may actually amplify the impact, considering that many research shows that polyester that originates from recycled plastic bottles actually sheds microfibers compared to virgin polyester. So the moment that we go and we wash the t-shirt, that pair of leggings, jeans, whatever it is, you are actually creating a problem even bigger than replacing the polyester made out of virgin oil. So this is often, and let me say that in terms of recycling content, nothing goes more than 20%. And again, I'm talking about no recycling garment. So the garment is not recycled, doesn't exist that option. It is recycled fabric. So the fabric that is used to make the garment, be it jeans in my case, there is an excess that is recycled. When the jeans is sold, so when the jeans ends up in the hands of the consumer, that is destined to landfill, best case scenario, reused in a second-hand shop, and therefore the second-hand market, and extending the life cycle of the product. Otherwise, will end up in landfill or incinerated, or being unfortunately dumped in lower markets, notably Africa, where most of the second-hand clothes that are collected in Europe end up, because people discard their clothes. In Europe soon there will be an obligation. In Italy will start from I believe next year, in France from 2023, an obligation to recycle clothes. But at the moment there isn't a single, unless we are talking about pure fabric, and the most recyclable one is wool. All the other ones are not recyclable. There is no infrastructure in place. And even the chemical recycling, and there is a very advanced company, Swedish company, that is working on that technology. It's, again, reinforces the argument of mass consumption, of consuming, shortens the life cycle of the product. So things should be made to last. Collection should happen, that should be shorter. So instead of having Zara's 50 collection per year, probably better quality collection. And I would say a pair of jeans that instead of lasting 2 years, so 3 years, some brands make it last 10, at least 10 years, a minimum 10 years, a very minimum 10 years. And to go back to what you were saying in terms of net zero is a bit of a, it's a bit of a utopia in terms of the way that things are actually moving. Means that we will be recovering as many emissions that we are putting in the atmosphere. But net zero applies only at a global scale. If a single company cannot be net zero, this is if the country is not net zero, if the continental scale is not net zero, that will have a very insignificant impact. And unfortunately, again, we remain on the concept that we can steady our business model simply balancing out emissions, which I can assure you, there is not enough land in the world to plant forests and to compensate for the emission of our business models.
Okay.
So this is, it is very net zero 2050 besides is actually even more than greenwashing, because net zero 2050 will be just too late. It is too late.
Sure.
Some countries demanded 260, 270. And the urgency that is needed is not reflected in those very, it's like kicking the can down the hill. I mean, we are not really with net zero 2050. They will not address it should be 50% reduction in emission by 2030. That is what is demanded, and that should be the real target.
Right. I hear you. I'm going to pivot back to Nadine here, because I mean, while that is it's an important reality check, it's also a grim one. And I think that particularly in the context of a country like South Africa, our relationship to land and textiles and people is complicated, you know. So when we have this conversation and you know, there is this, I don't want to call it pessimism, but realism around what is and isn't possible on a global scale, I wonder in South Africa, what is, in your mind, what is the kind of state of textile recycling in South Africa? It would be helpful probably if you could help us just understand the difference between chemical and mechanical recycling. But in the context of South Africa, understanding our textile, our relationship to this market, Nadine, you know, what are the key issues here? How far are we from where we would ideally want to be if we were just talking about textile recycling?
Okay, so Binwe, thank you for the question. I'm going to try to pick up with Christina's comments, Federico's comments as well. Also, hear me out from a scientific point of view, because I am an academic, so what's been happening there as well. I think if we look at South Africa and also listening to all the sessions that we have this fall, one thing that I would say of South Africa that's great is that we've got really a bunch of very innovative people locally that have gone on and have become very entrepreneurial, especially with COVID-19, you know, to start small businesses in reusing garments, reusing textiles, you know. And another thing that Jackie also alluded to, that's another big aspect in Africa pertinently, and that the other, you know, Christina and Federico has also mentioned, is the big amount of secondhand clothing that's disposed of, donated from first world countries, you know, like Europe, USA, that finds its pathway into Africa. I think that, you know, there's a good, a bad, and a very ugly to that one, and it's an entire conversation on its own. But for those reasons, you know, coming to the whole issue of recycling, and I'm going to try to, in a very short span of time, explain what's been happening on chemical and mechanical recycling and the developments that's been happening there. These things, you know, recycling per se becomes very important, and the research development that goes into it. And we have some of that in South Africa, but certainly not enough. And we're not where our, you know, counterparts abroad are. But let's just briefly talk about mechanical recycling. So the most typical one that we know of is the shredding and the cutting, you know, of your garments into smaller slivers. Obviously, that also comes with the removal of hardware. There's always the issue of hardware that needs to be removed from the garments. But typically also with mechanical recycling, the problem that comes in there is that very often the fibers, once it's shredded and cut, is of a weaker quality. So they're shorter. And so they have to be combined with stronger fibers to make them viable to be reused, okay? And that's why a lot of mechanical recycled fibers goes into things like insulation, carpet underlays, and that type of thing. There is a bunch of small entrepreneurs in South Africa particularly that's also looking at that, working at it, combining it with recycled polyesters and so forth. So that's commendable, but they're few and far in between. There is overseas other types of mechanical recycling that's also happening. And the one is what they call mechanical thermal recycling. Sounds a little bit borderline to chemical, but what they do is they melt your fibers, it's particularly synthetic fibers. It's only synthetic fibers that can go in there, like nylon 6, they melt it and respun it, you know, so respun. But the problem with that is the cost is high. So capital investment needed for that in a country like South Africa is quite substantial, okay? And so we don't have a lot of that. Another thing that's happening in some developing contexts that also can go under the classification of mechanical recycling is where they use agricultural byproducts like pineapple leaves and so on. That's actually also shredding, converting into fiber. So that's also a category that a person can look at. But now the big thing is coming to the chemical recycling, and that's quite complex. And without going into technicalities here, you've got two types. The one is the monomer chemical recycling. The other one is the polymer. They're very different in the sense that at this point in time, the monomer chemical recycling can only be used for synthetic fibers. So it cannot be used for, and Christina, you're going to like what I'm going to say just now, share with the blends, because we call it monstrous hybrids, but they are working on technology there as well. So with the polymer recycling, chemical recycling, you know, they can dissolve, but usually, you know, the problem with that is you end up with you know, a fiber that's perhaps of lower quality. So you've got those two distinctions in terms of the chemical recycling, the monomer and the polymer, that also focuses on different types of fibers that can go into the process there. Always, as Federico rightfully mentioned, the biggest problem, okay, that's mentioned also in the conference earlier this year is the, how can I say, the sorting of the feedstock. There's always hardware that needs to be removed. That always needs to be sorted out, you know, in terms of, how can I say, you know, the fiber content, the predominant fiber content. However, and this was shared, and I was phenomenally astounded by what they were saying. In the UK particularly, there's a company that's, they call them Wong Again Technologies. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. But so they started developing technology to, how can I say, separate the fiber, or to deal with, you know, these fiber blends. So in the conference, Cindy Rhodes, that's the founder member of that, said their estimate is that by 2040, they want 40 plants, you know, that they want to erect in the UK, recycling about 2 billion tons of textiles. So that's a phenomenal task, you know. But now, so this is all great. And I think particularly, you know, if we think of a South African context, coming back to that, my point is we don't have that technology yet here in South Africa, yet we get all the secondhand clothing from the first world countries. So honestly, there is something to be said for your bigger companies in more advanced economies to invest in South Africa, you know, so that we can deal with all that secondhand clothing that's ending up in our markets. Because technically speaking, you know, you talk about fast fashion, overconsumption, but here in Africa now, we've also got the secondhand clothing, and there's only so many times that you can reuse and recycle a fiber. Where does it end? Okay, where does it end? Somewhere along the line, it needs to end up, it will end up in a landfill. Now, the last point that I would like to mention, and that's a very interesting point where us as scientists are very focused on, because of this question of where does it all end? You know, you can use it, reuse it so many times, is the bioprocesses. And the bioprocesses, there's two types at this point that's been developed. The one is more the biological part, where they use microorganisms, and it works on natural fibers, semi-synthetic fibers as well, but particularly the natural fibers like wool and so forth, where they're using microorganisms to decompose textiles, all right? The other one is where they're using enzymes. And enzymes is more that they use it on cotton, things like linen, cellulosic-based fibers to dissolve those. And now where these developments and these innovations become very, very important is that last step where we don't know how to reuse, how to recycle, where to resell anymore, is that we can use those processes to break down the textiles, if it's done in the right way, to get it back as nutrients into soil. But at this point, the development, it's obviously not scaled yet. It's not scaled. It's still inception phase. And obviously a lot more capital investment needs to be done on the research and development there. But that's kind of where the scientific circles is moving to, because they see it as the last step. When there's no more place for the textiles to go, that would be the process that we're looking at. But we're still a far cry from understanding how to do it with synthetics.
Yeah. Right.
That's unfortunately the complexities.
I totally hear that. Christina, I want to get your perspective on this, because I mean, a lot of the designers that I've spoken to and worked with, particularly African designers, I mentioned, for example, somebody like Bubu or Gisi, are of the opinion that another way to kind of approach this is to not only think about how we understand our relationship to old textiles, but also how we understand our relationship to old practices and you know, so weaving, for example, is an ancient craft, some of these, you know, these indigenous systems really work and were inherently sustainable. So as our expert weaver and the person who kind of understands these pre-colonial techniques, what is the value of actually reaching back into history in terms of the way we understand our textiles and our technique with textiles? What can going back to those techniques actually offer us, particularly the communities who are working in that space?
Well, I've asked myself that question a million times while I was a student, and going back to history. So I was very focused on zero waste fashion as well. And going back to history, I found that actually zero waste fashion existed in all civilization. You know, you have the sari in India, you have all the drapes in Greek mythology. So at that time, people were using materials based on the location, so what was available to them. So the UK was using wool, you had hemp and flax in Central Europe, Asia, cotton in India. So I think going back to history, I kind of realized that how far removed we are from what we consume. And that's not even to textiles, that's even in the food industry. We consume so much imported products, we don't actually know what's grown in our own country. So I think going back to traditional artisanal skills could bring back the value in the way we consume things, because as Federico said, it's all about fast fashion. It's the overconsumption that's the problem. Perhaps maybe if we learned more about how even like farming, people don't plant food anymore. So if we went back to these practices, perhaps we would realize how much effort and how much the environment is damaged in these processes. But from a weaving perspective, this led me to actually doing a lot of research about cotton and how cotton throughout 700 years was drastically changed into what people call now the dirtiest crop in textiles. But for over 1,000 years, it was grown, you know, seasonally, household based. So how did people grow to cotton for 1,000 years without damaging the environment, you know? So how did we turn that crop into such a demonized plant in the 21st century? But then going back to what Federico said, because of consumption, overconsumption, I tend to believe that we have enough resources now to keep it in the loop, to keep producing new things instead of extracting more. So one of the businesses that I really like at the moment, that it doesn't really touch on artisanal skills that much per se, but it's the Redress Collective in Hong Kong, where they encourage designers to develop zero waste pattern making using discarded materials or any secondhand material. So actually slow production, I think, is the way to go, whether it is through indigenous artisanal craftsmanship or even incorporating modern technology with zero waste practices. So there's this amazing academic called Dr. Holly McQuillan. So she wrote a book about zero waste fashion. So she's trying to do research about weaving, how they could weave zero waste clothes on the loom itself. So with minimizing production at the end, so like putting the pieces together, so woven zero waste on the loom. But yeah, I don't know if this kind of answers your question, but there's a lot of things going on, like new technology, innovation, blending with artisanal craftsmanship. I think there should be a collaborative conversation among you know, all of these experts, all these thinkers. But I do think, as Federico mentioned, it's the overconsumption that's a problem. And going back to the secondhand clothing, I wasn't aware that they were sold in South Africa. I knew that they were flooding Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, but until today, thank you for sharing that. It's such a big topic at the moment, especially with the global north thinking as that when they're donating clothes, it's just magically disappearing. Yeah. So yeah, it's just chaotic.
It is chaotic and it's messy and it doesn't have answers, and that's why I suppose even if it were up to me, we would probably be still speaking in the next 2 hours, but I see my clock is against me actually. So I'm going to go to Federico on the last question because I see the chat is bubbling with questions and I want to make sure we take those. Federico, understanding, you know, the conversation that we just had about, you know, these challenges around what I suppose we could codify as like ostensibly really good positive technologies that we can use that are actually bumping against really difficult real life circumstances. I think that's kind of the rub that we're in. But of course, you know, you have some access to some of the innovations that are being developed, the best practices for how we get to where we should be getting to. So just from your perspective, and you can relate this just to denim or more broadly, what do you think are some of the innovations that are going to have a really positive impact and that are actually reachable for us to do? And what are some of the best practices, both as consumers and businesses, that we really have to get into the habit of doing if we hope to make these circular fashion systems a reality? What is the best case scenario outcome for you?
Okay, so in terms of technological advancement, I can say that denims are one of the most researched garments, and probably because they're quite easy to recycle also. So there are a lot of brands, even the Ellen MacArthur Foundation jeans redesign program has advanced interesting solutions. From my personal knowledge, there are some brands that are developing denims jeans that are fully compostable. So that are made 100% of organic material, being also the, instead of using the polyester as the joining thread, they use a compostable bio-based material that act as in place of the polyester. A pair of jeans that lasts, you use for many, many years. You can resell it. You can give it away as second-hand. If you don't want, if you are someone that wants to have full control, and besides, denims, the older they get, the nicer they look. So at a certain point, after 15 years, I would say 20 years, because this is what used to be the Levi's jeans of the 80s, used to last 20 years without any problem. Let's say you use it, and then you can compost it, and there are and the material returns to the soil. So the stock of the resource is returned to the soil, and that is effectively closing the loop. So there are some t-shirts as well that can be composted. The problem is, obviously, that pair of jeans costs you 270 euro. Okay, so there is also a problem of affordability. And a family parents cannot obviously have 2 children and buy a pair of jeans that are 250 euro per pair. Perhaps with economy of scales, they might drop down to 150 euro. So in my opinion, we go back always to the same point. The key is consumption. We need to buy quality, but less. We cannot have 100 pair of jeans in our wardrobe. That is unsustainable by default. And let me say another point, because here we talk a lot about just the environmental impact. I have to say that, unfortunately, another way to go back to what Christina was saying, indigenous, local, artisanal fashion, that is the way that fashion can be truly sustainable. When things are made in Europe for Europe, Italy was a major producer of fashion. In Africa for Africa, and I've seen some African fashion designers producing clothes for Africa, so not imported from Europe, where often you don't need the pool that we use in Europe. You don't need it for your temperature. Using local expertise would allow also to create better working conditions for people, better wages, working conditions for local people. Let's talk about Mauritius. Here, Mauritians, they don't want to work in textile anymore. Even if compared to India, Bangladesh, China, working conditions might be way better and salary much better, but they don't want to do it. So what they do, they use Bangladeshi people imported here. So what they are called, the new modern slaves. What used to happen back in the days with the indentured labor of Mauritius that came from India on an obligation of 5 years contract to work is happening not at that level, with obviously more rights, but at the same time, when a Bangladeshi worker is imported to Mauritius, okay, it needs to stay at least 3 years to make it viable, because there are all sorts of regulation to go through. Thank God, I would say. I mean, thankfully we are not like back at colonial times. But anyway, if that pair of jeans had been produced locally in the US, in Europe, in Africa, in Australia, those sort of problems wouldn't exist. And so the market would allow to pay fair wages, and at the same time, the product will be more sustainable. That is often the problem with globalization and with companies, the externalities at environmental and social levels. What the customers doesn't pay when clicking the button in England, in Germany, in Canada,
Right.
are unloaded onto the people that make those clothes. So the technological advancement is good, is there for the, I'm just referring to denim jeans for my case, but unfortunately the social working conditions are not following the same trajectory. That is the reality. That is the reality. And Mauritius is in a pretty good situation compared to the Asian producers, where sweatshop working conditions are way more common.
Sure. Thanks. That's an important insight, and it's something to think about, especially in the context of, you know, even a place like South Africa, where we've got like the highest youth unemployment, you know, in the world. It's like, is that an industry that would necessarily even positively welcome those people? Would it be a living wage? It's not just about doing the right thing for the planet, it's also how do you think about people. So I'm sure the next moderator probably already wants to kill me, so I'm going to wrap this up. So I mean, Federico ironically has answered 2 of our quick Q&A questions in his response. So I'm going to jump back to Nadine to help us close here, because I really want to bring it quite literally back home. When we think about these, all of these kind of different push and pull factors, because I mean, I suppose if you were to use the kind of old school PETCO model of there's political, environmental, social, technological, and all of those, I think that this particular conversation brings to bear how intersectional all of these things are. There are scientific considerations, there's social considerations, there's legal considerations. How do you think that we can approach trying to really be responsible consumers, first of all, in an environment, particularly in South Africa, where we're also under a lot of pressure? So I can make a responsible choice as a person with a certain level of disposable income, because I can afford some of the responsible options that are available. But I think that what we ultimately want is a kind of groundswell of people buying into this circular fashion system at all levels. What could that look like for South Africans? How do we begin to, at all levels, buy into the system and make sure that we're doing our part to whatever extent that we can to further the kinds of initiatives and goals and targets that all of us have discussed today?
So Binwe, thank you for that. I'm gonna try to draw this together with my fellow panelists, what the comments they've also said, and drawing this with the research that we've already done in South Africa amongst consumer populations, really understanding, you know, their willingness to embrace this. What we found in the past very much is that consumers, it needs to be a win-win situation for them, for all of us, actually. Federico mentioned it. I am environmentally concerned as much as many other consumers out there know about the social issues, particularly during COVID when so many people lost their livelihoods. So they're aware of these things. They are environmentally concerned. They know they have to do something about the planet. But when it comes to being in the store, most of us can't afford all of those things, you know, even though we want to. So at this point in time, if you've got a product or you've got even something uniquely handcrafted, the thing about it is for consumers to really buy it, they need to, at this point, you know, it needs to fit in with their price category. It needs to fit in with their quality perceptions, all those other things, plus then address their concerns for socially and environmentally responsible. Then you've got a winner. But with that, I also want to say the last 2 years have changed the landscape in which we operate consumers, very, very specifically. And we've just finished research where we found that our consumers at this point in saying, you know what, I don't need that wardrobe of clothes. I don't need it. I don't need as much of that. And the quickest way towards low carbon is using existing fabrics, existing materials. So what if people started doing that, become more, okay, let's repair this, you know, all those. But I would say the biggest thing for our artisans out there and for people out there is to start encouraging our consumers to say, you know what, rather focus on something that is of better quality, that's better for the environment, and extend the longevity of that item rather than having 10 hundreds of it. Because in doing so, you're doing something better for people, for our planet, and for future generations. And I think we are ready with COVID-19 having really, really changed the landscape in which we operate, for consumers to start embracing that message a little bit more. So that's it from me.
No, that's a beautiful way to tie it all up. And that's basically was the end of my script. So now I'm going to have to make something else up. But no, seriously, thank you to our panelists so much for joining us in this discussion. I mean, as Jackie's saying in the chat, it's a conversation we can have forever. And I think that ultimately for our audience, especially, the question that we left with is, what is our contribution? What is our intervention into the space? Whether we're people who are working as experts, as writers, as consultants, as consumers, you know, what decisions can we start to make every day and share with the people around us to build this circular fashion system that we all want. So thank you again to all of our panelists. Immensely appreciate your time. Thank you to our audience for your amazing questions, which I've kind of just stolen for the most part. And don't forget to check out the rest of the sessions. We've got some really exciting things on the program for tomorrow together. Thank you to PETCO for presenting this session. Thank you again to everyone involved. And we will chat to you soon. And until then, buy responsibly, I guess. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.